Okay. All right. Why don't we can get rolling. I see we have a few folks that are on, and I know people are going to be joining as we go. I think that there were about 150 or 200 people, something like that, that registered to join our live recording. So, all right, why don't we get started? So I am here with Ursula Morgenstern and John Madeline. Thank you both for joining and taking some time with us. So just a little bit of background. Ursula is a C-level executive who has run major books of business for Atos, for Cognizant, in the billions of dollars, and has a very informed perspective about security, I found, in some of the conversations I've had with her. So looking forward to exploring that. John is a group level CISO that has had a lot of experience at Verizon, actually with the DBIR, the famous report. Was one of the co-founders of that, and then moved over to Cognizant. And I think it was at Cognizant that Ursula and John collaborated together. So there were some really interesting stories coming out of that. Most recently, the two of them have been working a bit on a few projects, one of those being trying to kind of bridge that gap that we all know exists between business leadership and the CISO's office, and trying to get everybody a little more on the same page. And as part of that, I think they agreed to come and talk about some of those issues here on our podcast. So just an administrative note, those of you that are listening and participating in our live recording, you're very welcome to flip questions over to us at any point that you want. There's a Q&A button, I believe, that you should have in your Zoom, I guess, instance. And so you can put questions forward as you hear things that trigger your curiosity and or comments, and I will dutifully try to include all those questions and comments into our discussion. It's worked well in the past, and hopefully will work well today. So with that, why don't we get started into the topic? So the topic we're discussing is that kind of CISO boardroom, senior executive relationship, and how that can work to the best effect possible. So maybe we start with John. John, you've been advising government and part of research assessing that gap between the boardroom and the CISO. What have you seen? What has that research shown you?
Thank you, Lev. Yeah, actually, it was one of the original founders of the DBIR, Wade Baker, now at Scientia, little boutique firm, who called and said, I'm still agitated because, we don't see enough, business attention to this huge and growing subject. So, I supported an exercise of surveying. It's about 75 board members, I recall, and about 50 CISOs. And there was some consistent feedback. The board members tell us, we want more storytelling. We want you to engage us, and we want that storytelling to link to business relevant information. Another consistent theme was that CISO presentations are often too technical, and terms like zero day and zero trust and false positive ratio, all of this sort of stuff. So just entering the room with the right sort of attitude to engage them. Those same CISOs tend to be inconsistent because maybe we are grappling for what will resonate, and tend to bring different dashboards at different times. Tend not to, by the way, address organizational obstacles, accountability, disjointed IT and security, legacy IT technical debt, and so on. And also tend not to push the scale of the problem when it comes, for example, to post-incident remediation. When you look at the cascade effect on some of those old IT systems, server sprawl, application sprawl, actually the number gets quite big. You've got to be realistic about priority, timeline, budget. So yeah, actually you could say that the things cited by board members as most critical actually fell dead last amongst the CISOs. That is a gap that needs to be addressed.
Different priorities and interests, I guess, from a different day-to-day existence. Ursula, what's your take as a C-level exec, former board member? What has been your personal experience regarding CISOs and business alignment?
From just as a preamble, of course, as senior exec C-level working in IT services, professional services, I'm already tech savvy. So I'm probably in that sense not your usual C-level CEO, CFO, a COO, because again, I have an in-depth understanding from technology. That said, reflecting back on my time and reflecting on some of the board discussions I have observed, cybersecurity is often represented and seen as this deeply technical niche risk, if I phrase it like that. And it's not put into context by the CISOs with the overall enterprise risk and business risks. Because of course, boards, business executive teams are actually discussing risk all the time. Risk management, I think, is a key factor in what you do there. You are assessing the risk to your top line, to your, what's happening in the market. So risk management is at the heart of what C-level executives are doing and boards are doing. But the way how CISOs are bringing risk does not feed into that conversation. Because what am I concerned as a board member is I'm not concerned about loss of data, loss of reputation, revenue loss, profitability loss, theft of IP, which actually might endanger my long-term business. I'm not so concerned in the discussion about, what's my patching doing? What's the phishing doing? This is detailed risks which are feeding into that overall risk. And therefore, from my perspective, we need to ensure that CISOs are able to discuss the business risk or the cybersecurity risk in the business context. But, equally, the board needs to understand a bit of technology. We can come to that later. The other observation I have made is, present people excluded, that cybersecurity is always a catastrophic risk. It's the end of the world is near. And therefore, it doesn't enable a manager or leader to have a balanced discussion. Where is actually my higher risk? Is it really in cybersecurity, or is it a human error? And I'm just using the example which I always use about HR data loss. I can lose my employee data through a cybersecurity breach, through hardware corruption, database corruption, or as we have seen with the Northern Irish police, a simple mistake that a spreadsheet has been sent out. And that has happened twice to me as well, that information was sent out to the whole company, which shouldn't. So again, when I discuss loss of data, I'm probably having a more holistic point of view, and then I will try to understand how high is the risk through cybersecurity in the overall context of loss of data. And so it's really enabling CISOs to have a fuller business discussion or business risk discussion would help in the, I think, in the positioning of cybersecurity on a board or a business level.
This raises a number of questions in my mind, actually, but I just want to turn it back to John first. So Ursula was just kind of talking about walking the shoes of the board, I guess, speaking the language of the board. What's worked for you as a CISO in the past to engage with boards?
Yeah, I mean, some of the comments I made on that board survey, that they are easier said than done, but the opener is really that soft skills storytelling. In my view, there's three key things: entertainment, scaring or alerting, let's say, and then what are we going to do about it? Those are the three key things. And in the early days in the security industry, there was this concept of fear, uncertainty, doubt. And so if you're going to do some alerting or scaring, it has to be substantive. But there's a lot of raw material. This is a world in which even the names of these perpetrators, Cozy Bear, Stone Panda, you know, the Lazarus Group and that bank heist, you know, that was, you know, with North Korea, you know, the raw material for the storytelling is just, you know, perfect. But you know, quickly dropping to that business enabling, you know, business leaders, you know, they want to know what the economic impact of failure is. And now supply chains are so interconnected that small interruptions can cause massive impacts. CrowdStrike being a recent example, and we know CrowdStrike was a simple little coding error, but you know, it was a wake-up call for the economic impact of failure of apparently small moments at little places in the supply chain. So you know, the role of data in supporting the physical business has changed pretty profoundly over the last 10 years. And therefore, you know, some of these incidents can really affect businesses materially in the physical flow of cash. So then finally, you know, linking that into, you know, specifics, you know, how are these people operating? What's the effect that it might have? How can we learn from others that are doing it well or those who failed? And then the focus and consistency of, you know, understanding what those key topics are that are resonating with the business and sticking with them. By the way, avoiding the stuff we just talked about, I had the benefit of working with Ursula at Cognizant, and there was an unwritten rule that she'd take it as read, that those little techie details were being dealt with. But once we've identified the stuff that the business cared about, we held ourselves accountable to make sure that they were supported.
Hmm. It's interesting. You talk about storytelling and kind of bringing out some of the scary stuff. On the other hand, Ursula just mentioned that sometimes the CISO comes across as if the sky is falling. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but that's kind of what I heard. Ursula, any thoughts on that tension? Anything else you have to add?
It's, of course, you need to highlight the real risks, but again, if you have, you know, there will be a range of cybersecurity risks, which ones is worth highlighting, but actually, which ones do really matter. If I, and again, what data, when would I actually be, as a business leader, worried about a loss of data? What is critical? What really brings the company down? And we have seen that actually companies are much more resilient than we think they are. We have seen how we all survived COVID-19. Within 48 hours, we had to go from office to offsite. I once had to exist 72 hours with all of our data centers as a, you know, at a previous employment, not being able to serve our customers. We survived 72 hours. So we can survive. We are more resilient than we think as companies. And therefore, on the other hand, when is it really damaging? So for example, if I have R&D development in a new technology, which really will set me up in future, and that IP is stolen, that will destroy my whole business model. If I have, God beware, somebody hijacking my plane or my train or my car because, you know, Internet of Things is not safe enough, that is loss of life, which always needs to be protected. Is it from all the data we have in our companies? Some data is worth protecting, others isn't. And therefore, that is actually a discussion which the CISO and the cyber should have with the business. What is worth protecting? What do you consider really as the risk which brings the company down? Is it that our manufacturing system is down for 3 days? Is it the IP theft? And if it's IP theft, what type of IP? Because only if the business, if the CISO has communicated clearly with the business and had a dialogue, then can you actually assess, yes, it's a high risk? Because if I then know, yes, that IP is very, very safe and our crown jewels are not protected, that is a risk which needs escalating. And that is not taking place. I mean, I've been part of lovely presentation where I was listening to upgrade programs to 10,000s of servers, and you're just saying, okay, 3% of servers not yet upgraded, and you wonder, is that a problem or not? Or if I hear, oh, that person pressed 3 times on the phishing email, do I really, do I have to worry or not? That depends on the role of the person. Again, I know it's a slightly more complicated, but the so what factor is often not presented, or often it's a technical risk which is presented, which I, as a executive, cannot translate into a business risk. Because again, the 3 people, do I have to worry? Or is it somebody in a position which is really relative? Or, is it my system administrator who has access to my Active Directory? Then I might be really, really worried.
Right. It feels like we're kind of walking around an issue of quantification, of having some way to consistently score perhaps the risk impact of different factors. And John mentioned the CrowdStrike incident. I mean, it was like what, a patch on a release. There's some code that got, I mean, there's so many little things that have to work perfectly in order to not have an incident like that. And most of the time they do. Of course, we only notice when they don't. But like, what are your thoughts on the way to kind of have a quantified or risk scored discussion around all these issues that can be meaningful?
I think the first one I would add is it needs to be moving away from only a technology discussion in a business discussion, and not only because of the risk conversation I just had, but also not all risks are introduced through technology. I mean, I would think, I know you're talking, human error is big for you
Yes.
from your perspective, and we know it plays a huge part as part of the of the attack chain. However, again, if I think about some of the supply chain incidents, it can be also, what do our contracts say? Do we understand which customers are serving, what data they have access to? There's, in addition to the people element, there's actually often a process element to it, especially when it comes to supply chain, and of course a technical element. And as long as executives and board members have the impression it's a technology topic, they will never widen the conversation, because the mitigation, and that's coming back, the mitigation to my 3 data centers are down, not through cybersecurity, will be manual processes, will be backups. I mean, again, the solution to a cybersecurity risk or cybersecurity incidents will be not only a technical solution, but the business needs to step up. So I think the business needs to therefore, I think we need to discuss it as technology, process, and people, which are the 3 elements which I think we need to make sure cybersecurity is discussed as. Then coming to the quantification, of course, quantifying the risk is why do I think it's important? Because the key language of business is money. If you go into a management meeting or board meeting, one of the first things is what did we do this quarter? How did we do this quarter? What's the growth doing? What's the bottom line doing? And it's a business discussion, and most risks are translated into dollars. And you can do the same with cybersecurity risks. What is the risk? The potential loss value of me losing my employee data, my customer data, and having a number attached to it is creating a dialogue with the business and saying, these are our top 5 risks based on a dollar value or pound value or euro value. And that is, again, a conversation which enables the management team and the board to interact with you. Because let's say John comes and says, Ursula, our biggest risk is IP theft. Then I say, we can have the conversation. then you have automatically a conversation. So what are the factors which will influence IP theft? It will be our employees, it will be our onboarding processes, it will be our Active Directory, it will be phishing, it will be a number of things which will impact the risk IP theft of, and then we can say, so what do we do to keep that safer? And it will be, again, technical, process, and people measures which will do that. And by having a discussion about a number, a risk number, and not, we need to fix these 5 things because they might lead to an IP theft, you have an active conversation in the management team, which is, I think, what everybody wants, because you want to have engagement from everybody in the management team, from the board, to be part of that conversation. That's why I believe assigning risk, first of all, it gives you a language, or risk value gives you language, but also it immediately gives priority.
John, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, it sounds like we need to be certainly less technology only, more people process technology. Is that something that's feasible? What gets in the way of doing that?
I think it's partly you mentioned earlier, Lev, the lens through which we see things, and it feels that it's relatively recent that the CISOs are really understanding, you know, the psyche of board members, and they're just like you and I, but they're operating at a different level and in a different way with different priorities and perspectives. And it was interesting that many CISOs we interviewed said, yeah, we were really, you know, taking the board members out for a beer, but the board members were saying we haven't got a clue what they're talking about. So that gap needs to, you know, be led by much more persistent interaction and understanding. And, you know, as far as those presentations, whilst we understand, as Ursula was outlining, that, you know, cyber has a significant technical component, you know, those technical aspects don't need to be addressed in the boardroom. You have to build the board confidence that the table stakes stuff is being done well. And, you know, find a way to distill the key things that need doing into that sort of engaging and understandable format. You know, it's funny that we, you know, Ursula and I have also been talking with CISOs and even showing the evidence. Many CISOs we've met are still reluctant to let go of that safety net of technical. You know, there's 6 key essentials that I've found over the years that are found in every cyber attack. And I sometimes mischievously offer business leaders a crate of champagne if they can find any cyber attack not down to those 6 key essentials. Probably dangerous on this podcast because somebody will have come up with one. I'm going to lose my crate of champagne. But, you know, 2-factor authentication, just being sure that the people that you're dealing with and that are accessing the stuff you care about are who they say they are. In the old days, we used to say just for web, but now everything's kind of facing either directly or indirectly. Second key thing, the privileges. Anyone goes a little deeper, make sure you really know who they are. Third key thing is monitoring. Sometimes people say, hey, you're cheating there. That's really complex. So we'll come back to that just briefly in a moment. Fourth thing is the end points. You know, the vast majority of perpetrators are looking for the stuff you care about. It's probably on the servers, but there are other endpoints that we care about in the supply chain too. Even if you were to say, let's just make absolutely sure the stuff we care about on the servers, most organizations don't even know where all those servers are. Server sprawl and application sprawl being quite common. And then the last couple of things, application layer, you know, those coding disciplines, you're never going to get them perfect, especially in today's complex environments. But, you know, a little bit of hygiene goes a long way. And then the final thing, offline backup. You know, by the way, cyber insurance now says if you don't have 4 of those things, 2FA, privileged access monitoring and offline backup, you can forget getting insurance. So obviously, you know, running the numbers, our insurance colleagues are presumably seeing the same thing. Just to close, the cheating on monitoring, there's a great book by a guy called Cy Hooder that I sometimes recommend and tell people, look, if you read this book, you know, you're not going to want to talk to me anymore. It's called Next Level Cybersecurity, and it looks at what the signals are in monitoring, 15 key signals. And as I read that book, I thought, you know what, over the last 20 plus years of running and handling incidents, those are the persistent signals. It's because cyber criminals do tend to be lazy. Those 15 signals are relatively easily detected. And that's my cheeky second creative champagne, Lev, that if you can find a material cyber incident not down to those, I'll give you a second crate. So then it's about, by the way, connecting those to the business issues that they support. What matters? Well, do a crown jewel analysis. Where's it sitting? It's probably on some servers somewhere. How's it used? Understand which applications you've got and what they're doing. Who's it used by, and how's it being moved across the supply chain? Who's accessing? Who's sharing? Who's trying to mess with it, the monitoring, and what happens if it's interrupted? Those start to move us in the business direction, but they're rooted in the technicalities at a relatively simple and structural level that in most cases play a big role in when you're hit. Why does it hurt?
Yeah, and it sounds like the business has got a role to play in helping to quantify which pieces of data, which applications, which processes, which organizations can hurt the business the most. So there's kind of a collaborative effort there to quantify where you're going to have the biggest impact, isn't there?
Yeah.
Perhaps just a word to what John just said. I mean, again, I hear from many CISOs and cybersecurity professionals, surely the board needs to learn about technology and cybersecurity, and they do. But if you are a board member, especially a supervisory board member or busy executive, you're learning at the moment about sustainability and climate change. You're learning about AI. I mean, again, there's only so much learning a senior board member or a senior executive can do. So you need to think about it. What can they learn and what can they really keep in mind? And that's what I like about the simplification being brought by John, because it just gives me the 6 technical areas which are in general relevant. And the book John mentioned is actually very readable, also for a business person. And that gives me a framework. And it would give the CISO a framework to say, look, we really need to deal with these 3 issues because of. So I think technology, yes, they need to understand and they need to learn about cybersecurity, but it's such a fast moving field. They will only ever be able to learn about concepts and high level factors. And that's coming back to storytelling. Storytelling is as old as human mankind, and the incidents described in that book and the attack chains described in that book is like a story told. And if you find incidents in your industries or similar incidents which you are worried, which might have used the attack chain, which you might be worried about as a CISO, tell that story, use the incident and saying, this is where we are potentially exposed. And that, again, storytelling becomes, and who doesn't like crime stories? I mean, again, podcasts, the most popular podcasts are crime stories. As John said at the beginning, you have a lot of crime stories to choose from when talking to the business. But coming back to your question, of course, the business needs to decide the priorities. Why should a CISO? It's not the CISO's responsibility to decide what is the most important asset of the company to protect. That should be the CEO, and that should be the board, and that should be the management team. And they need to have the confidence that they can have that discussion. And as long as they are worried deep down, cybersecurity is something very technical, I don't understand it, I will never understand it, they will not feel comfortable to have that conversation with you. the conversation about what are the assets which are at risk, what is the data which are at risk, what are the systems which are most at risk. I mean, that's not a very technical discussion. That is a discussion you can have easily with each business owner. And it's really coming back to how do you create an environment where you can ask, the business feels free, or the board feels free to ask questions and is able to discuss a cybersecurity relevant topic without the fear to embarrass themselves because they don't understand the technology. And we John and me like the board kit from the National Cybersecurity Center in the UK. It's essentially really simple. It's just, I think, gives board members over 100 questions they could ask their CISO. And John and me, for fun, reversed that and saying, how could a CISO take that to the board, and preparing themselves using the board kit from the NCSC to position themselves, to drive their presentations, to engage the board in conversations. So for me, yes, the business has the ultimate ownership, and therefore, and the business needs to step up and take that ownership in cybersecurity, and the CISOs need to help the business to understand that they can talk about cybersecurity without having a degree in PhD in technology.
Right. Excuse me. No, that makes sense. We're getting a couple of questions here from Satya Katira. And actually, folks, feel free to throw your questions in and we'll work them into the conversation. So one of the questions is clearly for John, just to say what the name of that book is that you mentioned, and name an author. I didn't write it down.
It's called, I'm going to hold it up to the camera there, Next Level Cybersecurity. And it's by a guy called Cy Huda, S-I-A-H-U-D-A. Detect the signal, stop the hack. And the thing I liked about it is it breaks sometimes you look at the attack chain. An attack chain is one of those phrases that seems to terrify business leaders. They think you're going to get techie with them, but actually it's a great phrase that they need to get comfortable with, because it helps them understand that the entry level into your organization is just generally 2 or 3 key things that are pretty straightforward, and that there are steps and stages that criminals take from there in these franchise models on the dark web, where they then sort of buy a little tooling to get a bit deeper and further and so on. So, that whole attack chain model is so critically important, because it also shows if you detect it early, it's low cost. And, minimum disruption. If things get too far down the chain, they own your IT systems and you're in trouble. But also that those signals are the ones that they're just so persistent and consistent. And I think, as Ursula mentioned, I mean, one of the things we've batted backwards and forward, is there a really good book that helps the board understand just enough of the specifics, but is easily readable and engaging? And I think that's the other thing that Cy Huda does well. So some specifics, by the way, that then link to those 6 key things that I think need to be done well. And again, are presented in a way supported by case study after case study. And, again, it's a great book on both sides. It's a great book because it could fuel the CISO's ability to do a little bit of storytelling. And it's, helping the business really understand going on. My analogy is, I've got an old vintage car I inherited from my dad, Carman gear. It started to smell a bit, petrol-y, and I took it into the garage. Don't worry, John, we found a little leak and we fixed it, and here's the thing. And, so then if you ask the next question, and it's fascinating as you go down a few details into some of the specifics in a relatively simple engine, but by the way, I'm not comfortable with engines. But as I was stood there, I thought, this isn't someone with 5 certifications and a master's degree. It's a specialist who's learned to communicate with me in a way that makes me comfortable, that he knows what he's talking about. He's done the job well, but that if I ask for the deep dive, I'll get it. It just, once it got a little too deep, then it started to lose me a little bit. And that's the sort of, those are the sort of analogies that we need to take. What's the level that we calibrate? because in each of those key areas, I absolutely accept that when you lift the bonnet, to extend the analogy, you're going to have mechanics and engineers that know their stuff. It's just that you don't need to communicate, all of that detail to the board, unless, of course, you're asked for it.
No, that's a great analogy to work with. And thanks for mentioning that book again. We'll actually send it out with the recording so that folks have access to that. So I'm going to, Satya, I'm going to leave the second question for a little bit later when I think it'll become a little more appropriate. But just, John, you mentioned, actually, both of you have mentioned human error. And of course, when you think about attack chains, some of the statistics that we've seen out there coming from the Verizon DBIR, from Gartner, from other sources indicate that humans are often, very often, a significant piece of that attack chain. What's your take on that? Human error, how to manage that, how important it is?
It's funny, Ursula had sort of characterized my experience when I moved from building and running systems for large organizations to this CISO role. It was shocking how, as a CISO, you're seen as the department of no. And, that introduces, you're on the back foot. So before you even start adopting some different approaches and starting to work out how to better navigate the business, you actually, there's quite a distance to travel thanks to a lot of history. So, the difficulty in dealing with some of those human error issues, for example, phishing, is it can reinforce the department of no concept. And, a lot of companies have phishing exercises. And, there are some different opinions as to how good, bad, or indifferent that is. What I'd suggest is that everything in balance, but given that we are on the back foot and are seen as the department of no, don't overweight those exercises in reinforcing with business colleagues that you're tinkering around with all of those little bits and pieces, let's say. Because, by the way, what you'll learn if you do phishing exercises is roughly 1 in 10 people are going to fall prey to this stuff. So you're going to get 1 in 10 that you've got to detect. And the same is true. We talked about CrowdStrike. If you look at misconfigurations, particularly as, webs, I was going to start naming some of the big platform providers, technology, but yeah, I'll stay away from that. But the misconfigurations of those web integrations and web servers and so on, very, very common cause of failure, more human error technically, the whole concept of DevSecOps, so this stuff is going to happen. And it's not about necessarily confronting aggressively the challenge of stopping that. It's almost King Canute holding back the tide. You're never going to succeed. What you have to do, as we've been saying, is put in place those basic controls and ensure that your monitoring is working effectively. So when there are those human errors that get through, that the next layer or two is going to catch them. So, there's not, in my mind, a sufficient emphasis in that whole human error dialogue on how you detect it. It's not about making life difficult for users, but you've got to demonstrate through your approach that you anticipate that will occur. You'll work to improve, of course, through awareness and other programs, but that you're sufficiently mature to detect things if it happens. Boy, does that build confidence with leadership, and boy, will they then go halfway towards you to try and then help you improve the culture.
And I think just the comment, what I like about Hua is talking about users as threat scouts, employees helping to scout for threats. So instead of the employee being the stupid people, the people who are not doing, who are just too stupid to follow the rules. And we had Professor Sasse here, I think, on the 2 months ago here, and she, right. I mean, that webinar was really insightful in this regard. So I think from my perspective is it will happen. Don't read too much into it, that a board and the management team will discuss phishing reports. I always say that's light entertainment. Everybody understands phishing, and so suddenly you're ending up talking about phishing, knowing it's not the most important thing. So only because the board and the management team is talking about it, it's not that they will be, you know, just be aware that they will also be able to set that into context. That at the end of the day, we cannot make our employees as our enemy. Our enemy is outside of, you know, is out there, and we need to have them on our side. And last point, nothing is as infuriating for a manager if you only hear no. If you come to me and say, Ursula, we have a real issue, can I have, you know, there are 3 things which we could do. They carry the pros and cons with each. I can make a decision. If you come with a simple no, what am I supposed to do with that information or with that decision? So providing management with options and explaining the risk attached to each options is, I think, the way which you gain, you know, you gain friends.
Right. Right. You know, it's interesting. Yeah. Professor Sasa, I think her direct quote was, "Users are not the enemy." And I think she wrote a paper with that title as well. Very interesting. And of course, there's kind of that inside and outside sort of in-group, out-group dynamic she talked about on this podcast that was also quite interesting. And it's, you know, natural for folks to engage in that on the security team and in other teams as well. But there's also kind of this element of, and we've had a number, as part of the Cyber Human Risk Management Forum, we've had a number of discussions with practitioners in London and New York here and others, that where you feel a lot of security folks feel like they're kind of off on an island, that they're trying to push, like they're being blamed for any kind of security flaw that happens, and they're being pushed to kind of educate everyone about it and prevent things from happening. But it's still kind of their bag to carry, and it's really hard to get the business engaged in fighting the good fight, right?
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on that? I mean, how do you break through that logjam?
I mean, from my perspective, again, if I would, and I knowing now, having learned and worked with John in the last actually year outside of corporate context, that's where I really am firm and stay to the business. We need to step up. It's not the CISO's responsibility to create a corporate culture, nor it's the CISO's responsibility to develop effective training plans. We have a chief people officer in most companies for the later. So how do we ensure that the chief, and that's where I'm now talking as a business leader, I would hold my chief people officer accountable, that I have effective training programs, that I have, you know, that we are building together a culture. They often, you know, HR departments creating the value documents, the awareness trainings around culture, and of course, being led by the CEO and the whole supported by the CEO and the management team. And that's where it should sit. What I think a CISO can do is to make sure that it's not seen as too technical. What's the non-technical aspect of it? Because an HR director, I would nearly bet a bottle, you know, a cast of, you know, a champagne as well from my side, when you go to an HR director and say, can you please make sure we have great cybersecurity training and a great safety culture? They all would run away thinking, I have no idea about cybersecurity. So how do you create a culture, or how do you create a dialogue with an HR professional which makes sense to them? For example, after the book with Hua, I was thinking, yeah, we need to, the on and offboarding of contractors clearly needs special attention. And clearly I need to make sure then when somebody has all privileges to God knows what systems, that the offboarding of that works very well as well. So there are examples again where using the storytelling, you could say this is where cybersecurity, where the culture matters, that's where training matters, that's where HR process matters. You could even, I think in future HR departments should have cyber psychologists in their teams, because again, we will need that knowledge in the HR department. And that is indeed a challenge, which I think, again, so I think the CISO can help, but that they, to open up that, making sure the business starts to listen, but it's also as a business, we need to take responsibility. And we see the SEC, the FCA stepping up, asking, clearly the SEC is getting a bit impatient with how businesses or boards are owning the topic of cybersecurity. We have seen the new legislation coming in, or new guidance coming in, and coming in December last year it was, again, putting demands on what needs to be reported. And the SEC, we had that discussion, Lev, has really a say in how corporate reporting will happen, and therefore that boards and management team will start to take it more seriously. But yeah, I think we are leaving the CISOs on their own, which, knowing the threat level and the stress level, the cybersecurity professionals find themselves in is not justified, and the business needs to step up.
It's actually related to one of the questions that just came in from Roy. How should boards protect the CISO from legal action if resources are not infinite? And yeah, it's kind of germane to this discussion with the SEC, which actually could take personal legal action, right?
So I mean, yeah, from my perspective, again, CISOs are unfortunately now being put in the same position as other directors. So as a director of a company, Cognizant, I was a director of the company, therefore I had to sign every quarter that I was, had to fill out a quite extensive form about, how happy was I with the legal the controls, the internal controls in the company. Do I know about any risks? And there's one purely is insurance. Most companies have professional indemnity insurance, and again, you should be aware whether that is in place for you or not in future, once it becomes and that will come then understanding, what that includes. Normally gross misconduct is, for example, makes any insurance invalid. And then, of course, starting to discuss with that's number one. And number two, understanding your legal obligations. If you have legal obligations, you will have to fulfill them. I have been often in that position as a managing director of a country, in Germany, in the UK. I have legal obligations. And if those legal obligations would be crossed, or would be in danger, I would always have a conversation with the chief, my general counsel, but secondly, with the headquarter, and saying, hey, that's not possible here. This is against the law. And most, companies, nobody is going willingly, knowingly against the law, at least the professionals I have worked with. And therefore, again, you have to speak up. You need to, and in the worst case scenarios, you need to have the, I was in a position where I was really, really unhappy to do something in a completely different context. I asked for a written instruction from the board that is what I should follow. I only did it once in my whole career, but I felt so unsure about, I thought the impact of that was really significant. So I stood, you have to stand up and make sure it's documented. You can't do that again for every single risk you're coming across. You need to do it for the big ones.
Yep. No, that makes sense. I want to, if you don't mind, I do want to turn it back to the discussion we had before the kind of this personal liability topic. So in terms of, I think something you said resonated really with me, Ursula, that, we can't leave the CISO on their own. then they need sort of the support of leadership to make this a priority across the organization. John, what are your thoughts on that? And do you have any good examples that you've seen of creating that kind of security safety culture? Uh,
Having worked with Ursula, I deeply respect that accountability that she's describing that leadership needs to have to buy into the value of trust and resilience and confidence. It does mean that the CISO has to reciprocate and then has to sort of step up in terms of making the sort of linkages that we've talked about. And to have an outcome orientation alongside that sort of business sensitivity with the right Pareto focus and, again, business relevance, let's say. I inherited an organization that I'd worked on with Ursula that had a fair bit of legacy debt, let's say, in the old infrastructure, which has been common throughout my career. If I take a landscape view of all of the various organizations I've touched, and my primary focus in the day job was mid and back office security infrastructure that supported the work we're doing with clients. But the reality of modern IT is that those spokes in that hub of the mid and back office and spoke of reaching out to clients and partners, the supply chain, if they get hit, we're going to get hurt. And if we get hit, they're going to get hurt. So, in that case, as just one example, what we decided to do was a deal risk review to put a 10 to 12 page report together of what are we building and running, where are we connecting, what are the interdependencies, and how might they be managed, and how might we enhance the trust and resilience in the offering. And it was curious because when we first started to do it, some of the delivery and business leaders were, you stay away, you're the department, and no, we don't want you anywhere near this. And then you present, well, here's 15 pages that just, what's this? This looks like a consulting document. Why would you do? It's not part of your day job. No, it's not. But over time, if you introduce this, into the way that you're working, and then the next one and the next one and the next one, I will start to reduce the legacy debt. You'll start to value what we're doing more. That will allow me to invest more time and effort in the mid and back office, and away we go. But, one of the interesting byproducts of that were partners and clients going, hang on, you mean you're doing reviews to do assurance and resilience and confidence on things around the cybersecurity elements within work that we didn't call out cyber? Yes, we are. And, that additional trust and confidence really plays. So, just that example over time allowed us to really start to deplete that so-called legacy debt, service support, application support, and so on that we were just talking about. But to the gentleman's question, a few moments ago, I do think that CISOs tend not to push the scale of the problem. You get some very aggressive types who say the sky's falling and we need to invest hundreds of millions right away, and it's never going to happen. But you do definitely need to confront some of these organizational obstacles. You do definitely need to push the scale of the problem. Every remediation exercise I've seen turns out bigger numbers than anyone expected. So the fact that in a lot of cases IT and security are disjointed, that there is this legacy debt and it needs to be properly prioritized, and there needs to be realistic timescales. That, as Ursula mentioned, other functions like HR and legal have big roles to play, without which you're not, as a CISO, going to succeed. Big enterprises tend to be atomized, and so on. So, when you start recognizing actually there's a bigger problem, it extends into other parts of the business. But by the way, you don't expect that this is all going to be done overnight for a huge amount of money, but we all ought to be on a path to get us there. And, in that sense, then we need to be more comfortable on our dashboards of showing more reds, but then explaining what we're going to do about it that starts mapping to those priorities and, business rhythms. And if you do that, then you develop that, let's say unwritten contract or understanding with the business leaders that you're aligned, and, magic things happen when you start to get that rhythm right.
And I think one of the things, John, I think we never spoke about it, but when I came on, John had been in the organization. I came board. I had tens of people reporting into me. And it was actually, sometimes you don't have to have the direct, but I had several people whom I trusted coming to me and said, no, you need to include John in these meetings. And therefore, I always recommend to do a stakeholder analysis. Who is influencing whom? If you're trying to get to the CEO, to the general counsel, whom are they listening to? So they just say in one sentence, you can trust John, he's a good guy. It immediately, yeah, okay, I invite him. So again, sometimes in the indirect path, you need to work through to get into the inner circle.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that kind of personal credibility. So I think we actually ran 10 minutes over, even more. So I think we're going to have to end here. I know there's a lot of topics that I jotted down that we wanted to discuss, maybe cause for another session at some point. It's a lot of interesting things to discuss here. But thank you again so much, both of you, for taking the time to talk about these topics. Very important. We're going to be circulating the recording afterwards to everybody that registered, and putting it out on our website. Someone asked about the name of the podcast that we mentioned about users not being the enemy. We'll send that as well with the name of the book, as a reference for everybody, as a follow-up. And actually, our next podcast discussion is going to be September 26th, just a quick plug for that, where we're going to be talking with two of the CISOs who founded OutThink, the company that's hosting this. So looking forward to that one. It's going to be a little earlier, but in the morning, but that's okay. But again, a great discussion, and looking forward to the next time we talk. Thank you, guys.
Lev.
And thanks, everyone.